I think we're gonna get started. We'll just if people join as we're going. That's okay. But yeah, thank you everyone who is here. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and it's always exciting when this many people are interested in coming out and hearing about the changes we're doing and learning more about them. So today, the purpose of this webinar is to promote the recent changes to the zoning bylaw, which allow for up to 4 units per lot on all urban residential zones, and also provide some design considerations that need to be addressed in achieving this. And the contents of this presentation are based on the Guide for Developing Small-Scale Multi-Unit Housing, which we published today and can be found at a link I'm just going to post in the chat here. And it'll also be found on Engage Whitehorse as well. I just wanted to note, the city is committed to improving its level of service in our permitting processes, and we're doing this through some initiatives like e-permitting and the building workshops coming up next week. But today is not meant to be an in-depth discussion on that topic. So just for who we have from the city presenting today, my name is Aaron Kuntz. I'm a planner too with the Planning and Sustainability Services. We also have Darcy McCord. He's a senior planner with planning, and he led the adoption of these changes, and he's leading the overall zoning bylaw rewrite at the city. We also have Micah Olish. He's a senior development officer with Land and Building Services. They would be who would be reviewing your development permits. We have Shayla Baxendale, private development technologist too with engineering services. Dale Stebulek, sorry Dale, I think I mispronounced your name there. He's a private development technologist with engineering. We also have Taylor Eschfeeder. He's an associate manager of development, also with engineering services. And finally, we have Richard Diamond. He's a supervisor of building inspections, and they would be looking at your building permits. And I'm just going to launch a quick poll here to get a sense of who's here and why they're attending. So if you don't mind just filling that out, something interactive to get us going. It is loading quite slow. Okay, yeah, I can see some results come in. That's good. Okay, so while you guys are doing that, I'm just going to touch on the format. So we have everyone's cameras and mics muted for the presentation portion of today, and then we can unmute people during the Q&A. So during the presentation, we're going to hold questions to the end, but if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'll also be monitoring the chat, but it's just a bit easier to keep track of questions and make sure they don't get lost. And then as well in the Q&A, you can upvote questions, and that helps us gauge whether what the most common questions people might be having. And you can also raise your hand and speak to us directly. And we'll be spending about half of the time slot for the presentation and about half for the Q&A. So what we're going to do is discuss first what a zoning is, provide a brief summary of the changes that were made to enable a wider range of residential options on urban residential lots. And Darcy's going to walk us through that. And then Michael will touch on design considerations that need to be addressed to do this. Our engineering team will walk through some servicing considerations, and Richard will also touch on building code. And then just to wrap things up, I'll touch briefly on the development incentives that are available through the city, as well as some other government organizations, and touch briefly on getting started, as well as some resources that are available to help you. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. And I would just note today is being recorded, and the recording will be made available for people after the fact. So Darcy can talk about what a zoning bylaw is for us.
And sorry, Aaron, just before we get into that, do we have a summary of the poll results that we can share?
Oh, yes, sorry. I thought everyone could see that live. Um,
Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe everyone else can. Unfortunately, I can't.
uh, seems to just be. Hmm.
Okay, no worries. Um, oh, yeah, Glenda also says she can't see it.
Well, I'll work on publishing that while you're talking, Darcy. See if we
Okay,
can
sounds good.
share that.
Great. Well, thanks, Saren, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Before we get into the new housing regulations, I wanted to take a minute to provide a quick overview of what zoning is. Um, so the purpose of the zoning bylaw is to implement the goals and objectives of the official community plan through regulating the use and development of land and buildings in the city. In the simplest terms, the zoning bylaw controls what is allowed where. Just going to pause for a second there, Aaron. It looks like you've turned the presentation off.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to share the results.
Okay,
I'll
no
just get it
worries.
back up.
Sure thing.
Thanks for the
Um,
patience, everyone. Here we go.
no worries. So the what in zoning terms is referred to as uses. Uses are divided into broad categories: residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, and green space. And each of these broad categories is divided into more precise uses. So for residential, for example, there's single detached housing, duplex, triplex, townhouse, apartment housing, and so on. Commercial, industrial, institutional uses similarly are divided into more precise categories. Um, the the where is referred to in zones. So the city is divided into zones, and each zone describes what uses are allowed. So some zones might only allow residential and related uses. Other zones might allow commercial or a mix of commercial and residential uses. Other zones still might only allow institutional or industrial zones, for example. Um, so the zone regulations describe what uses are allowed in that zone. They also provide development regulations, so maximum building heights, minimum setbacks, or the distance that a building needs to be from the property line, maximum site coverage, and so on. And the zoning bylaw also provides general regulations for site design, for example, parking regulations or landscaping requirements for a new development. If you'd like to find what zone you're in, you can, there are maps at the back of the zoning bylaw, so you can look there and find the zone that you're in. You can also visit our online mapping platform. So we have a not very memorable link on the slide there, and we can share that in the chat. You can also get to it straight from the city website, whitehorse.ca. And there's an option called online services, and within that there's a menu item called GIS interactive maps, and that'll take you into the maps. Once you're in there, you can click on a property and it'll bring out a little pop-up window that tells you some information about that property, including what zone it's in. So onto the new housing regulations. So these came about, they were adopted in April of this year with the intent to enable a wider range of opportunities for residential development. This was a component of the overall zoning bylaw rewrite project, which is still underway, and we expect to have a new zoning bylaw to bring to council for consideration next year. But in the meantime, council was really interested to see some changes to the zoning bylaw happen sooner to enable housing development, enable more options for housing development. So we brought these amendments to the existing bylaw forward in this year. I'll move on to the next slide there. So just to give a summary of the changes that were brought forward and have been adopted, the regulations now allow up to 4 units per lot in all urban single detached zones. There's some relaxation of the site coverage and setback regulations in some zones where additional units are provided. Some changes to the living and garden suite regulations to allow more of them and to allow them in more places. And some changes to the parking regulations as well. For the 4 units per lot, most lots in the RCS, RCS2, RCS3, RD, RR, RS, and RS2 zones. So these are the zones that would generally be referred to as like the low density single housing zones, are now eligible to build up to 4 dwelling units in any configuration. There is one exception, which is attached dwellings. So for example, if you have a duplex where each unit is on a separate lot, those lots are not allowed to build up to the 4 units, but duplex attached dwellings can still provide suites. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later on. There are some site design requirements that still apply. So maximum height, setbacks, maximum site coverage, parking, and landscaping. There are still rules that apply to all of those. And they're intended to ensure that new development respects existing patterns of site design and building form, and that new development fits in with the surrounding neighborhood. So we've got some examples of what that could look like. Aaron, by chance, did you skip 2 slides there? There we go.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a block level example of what a small scale multi-unit housing could look like in the context of a typical residential block, and shows various configurations of multi-unit housing, and sort of how that fits in with the existing neighborhood. At the lot level, each lot can build up to 4 units in any configuration. Here's a few different examples. And I just want to point out that while 4 units is the maximum number of units, there might be some site characteristics or some developer objectives that make it more feasible or more desirable to build 2 or 3 units. So we've got a few examples here that show different configurations and also a different number of units on a typical lot. There are some changes to the site coverage and setback regulations. So in some of those residential zones, you get to have a little bit more site coverage or a little bit smaller setback if you provide an additional unit. So in this example, this is the RS zone. The typical site coverage for the zone is 40%, but if you provide an additional unit, you can increase the site coverage to 50%. I think it's important though to know that that maximum 50% or the reduced setback to 1.5 meters on both sides is not more relaxed than what's already allowed in some other residential zones. So it still kind of keeps within that the sort of the intensity and the building form that you'd expect in a residential zone. There are some changes to the living and garden suite regulations, and just want to make sure we're clear on terminology, because these terms are in different jurisdictions. There's different terms for kind of the same thing. So in Whitehorse, a living suite means a separate dwelling, a small dwelling that's attached to or within the same building as the principal dwelling. A garden suite is a separate dwelling on the same lot, but not attached to the principal dwelling. The changes here are that living and garden suites are allowed in conjunction with more housing types. So they're allowed in conjunction now with duplex, triplex, and townhouse housing. You can do up to 2 suites in any combination. So 2 living suites, 2 garden suites, or 1 of each in zones where suites are allowed. And that includes attached dwellings, like we were talking about earlier. There's no separate minimum lot size for suites anymore. So it used to be, for example, let's say the minimum lot size is 400 square meters, but you had to have a 500 square meter lot to be allowed to do a suite. That separate minimum has been eliminated. So if you have a lot in that zone, you can now add suites. Garden suites are allowed now in the front and side yards where space permits. Typically, that would only apply to very large lots. And there's some reduced setbacks for garden suites as well, to enable them to be placed anywhere that you already would have been allowed to place an accessory structure, such as a garage or a shed. And finally, the parking regulations. So there's a small change to the way that parking uh, requirements are applied when you're so typically or generally it's still the same, like you need one parking space per dwelling unit. However, if you provide two suites, you don't need to provide another parking space for the second suite. So in this example here, you need one in the first image, you need one parking space for the dwelling unit. If you add one suite, you need one for the dwelling and one for the suite. And then if you add another suite, you still only need two parking spaces, so you don't have to provide a third parking in that example. That only applies if you're building, if the additional units you provide are either living or garden suite. There's also a change to the setback requirement for where parking is allowed on the lot. So if it's in a driveway, it used to be that the entire parking space had to be beyond the front yard setback, and that distance would vary between 3 and 6 meters. So the back of the parking space had to be that far from the property line. That's been reduced now to just 1 meter. So it provides a little bit more flexibility in site design and allows parking to be located more easily in front of the house, and requires less site area to be devoted to driveway and parking as well. There is still a maximum driveway width. So if the driveway is accessed off of the street as opposed to the lane, there is a maximum there. So you can't do the parking with the full width across the front of the lot. But again, that 1 meter setback provides a little bit more flexibility for providing those parking spaces in front of the house. So that's a really brief summary of those new changes. And I'm happy to take any questions at the end of all the presentations. But for now, I will turn it over to Micah to discuss some of the design considerations for developing under these new regulations.
Okay, thanks, Darcy. I think that a little bit of what I have is going to overlap a bit with what you just said as well. But just to start off, noting that just because the zoning bylaw has been altered to allow for the increased density development, there's still a lot of design regulations in the zoning bylaw that still have to be met. That of course are easier to meet with new builds than trying to put new development, new residences onto existing residences, lots with existing residences. The first thing to note, though, is probably that if you're putting more than one building on a lot, only one building has to meet the front and exterior side setback regulations. So we've had some confusion where developers are looking at the setbacks and thinking that both buildings or three buildings or all four buildings have to meet the setbacks, but there just has to be one of the buildings on the lot that does. As noted here under point 1 in the slide, each building needs to have at least one entrance facing a street. This side is the side that we call the facade, and in comprehensive zones such as in Whistle Bend, each building's facade has to meet the comprehensive zone design regulations for facades, which include a number of items, including garage length, and that no portion of the garage can protrude past the facade by more than 50% of the garage's interior depth. Facades have to show at least two types or two colors of siding. the primary facade color may not be the same as the primary facade color of the residence next to it. And an entrance feature has to be included that's at least 2 meters deep and a width at least 25% of the width of the facade. So if you have a primary structure that meets that and you're putting in the garden suite also has to meet those same items, as would a second dwelling that's not a secondary suite or a third or a fourth. Now, when you start to build up a little bit in terms of density, then it gets harder to meet some of the other regulations that you might not necessarily think of when you're thinking about site design, such as storage of compost and recycling and refuse bins isn't permitted in the front or exterior yard setback. You shouldn't even really be seeing it. Storage areas for goods and materials also shouldn't be, it's permitted only in the rear and interior side yards in a residential zone. Things like RVs and trailers and boats, of course, aren't supposed to be visible during the time from October 31st to May 31st. So if you're especially a private developer or a citizen developer and you're thinking about adding 2 suites or a suite and a garden suite, then you might want to think about where it is that you're going to be putting your RV or your boat or utility trailer with ATVs, etc. Because every item that you add or every residence that you add squeezes a little bit more out of that available space. If you look at point number 2 in the slide, it underlines that walkways are necessary from the entrance of all dwellings. So whether it's a living suite or a garden suite or a residence, you should have a walkway from the entrance to any sidewalk or street that's adjacent and to any parking space that's on that lot. Did you want to switch slides, Aaron, please? Thanks. Okay, for the parking and access, Darcy went over that a little bit, but I'll add a couple points to it. Again, where there's a lane, access still has to be from the lane, and where access is from the lane, then you have a little bit more opportunity to develop parking because the required parking spaces, and we do have minimum sizes, which are in the zoning bylaw. They have to be met, but they can be right up against that rear property line, whereas in the front, like Darcy said, they have to be at least 1 meter back from the front property line. Now, only one access per parcel is preferred. That's the way it goes about 90% of the time. Sometimes we have been able to provide to allow more than one vehicle access, more than one driveway. If it's a larger lot and it's on a corner, and if the private development technicians review it and can see that they meet all relevant Transportation Association of Canada guidelines, it can be possible. So where there is no lane, the driveway can only be 6 to 10 meters. It depends on the width of the lot frontage. No matter how narrow it is, you can always have a 6 meter wide access, and no matter how large it is, it can't be any larger than 10 meters wide. No, not quite yet. Sorry. We run into a little bit, we see some issues sometimes regarding the parking, the access, and the hard surfaced walkways that we discussed earlier. So if you've maxed out your driveway width, you have it as wide as it can be, then you cannot have a hard surfaced walkway directly next to it, because in practice you're expanding the width of your driveway wider than would be allowable otherwise. I guess another point is that the minimum width for access for two-way parking where it's necessary. So if you need to get people driving in and people driving out as opposed to just a simple driveway, then that minimum width though would be 6.7 meters. If only one-way access is required, like if you do get approval for a second access, so you can enter in one street and exit the other street on a corner lot, then that can be reduced to up to 3.6 meters. Okay, next slide here. For the landscaping, as it says, 1 tree and 3 shrubs, and that's usually what we tell people, and the contractors, I think, have a good sense of that. But where we see some issues sometimes are that outside of that 1 tree and 3 shrubs, the landscaping regulations are ignored, because it also says there has to be suitable ground cover over the entire front yard. So that front yard is defined in the zoning bylaw as the area extending across the full width of the lot between the sidelines, extending all the way back to the nearest permitting building. So in most cases in a comprehensive zone, like in Whistle Bend, that's 3 or 4 meters. And that entire ground outside of any driveway access should be covered with some sort of landscaping cover, landscaping material. Gravel is okay, but it should be landscaping gravel and not driveway crush. So we see a lot of people trying to use that front for excess driveway area against that regulation for the driveway widths. So we do have to see that gravel interspersed with some amount of organic material like other shrubs or bushes. And that's all I have. I'll pass it on to Shayla and Taylor.
Good to go. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Hello, Taylor Ashpeter here, company with Shayla Baxendale from Engineering Services. I guess we're going to point out and provide a little bit of information context around a few guidelines that we have and where we fit into the review process. So Engineering Services participates in the review of development permits to the capacity of reviewing servicing plans and also grading plans for simple developments. Within, as it relates to the small scale housing densification up to 4 units, if developers are maximizing the density of their lot and going with 4 units, you could fall under what we call the complex stream, which is 3 units or more. Or if you're just doing 2 units, then you would fall under the stream of a simple development. And we have 2 separate guidelines because there's different requirements for each of those. And so within the last 5 years, we developed these 2 guides to provide developers with more information on what is required to check all the boxes to meet the requirements of the technical review through Engineering Services. And I guess I'll just point out that these are both available on the website under development and development permits and guidelines. Anything else to mention on this one?
Yeah, probably to mention. So, I mean, understandably, for simple developments, the requirements to have a complete development permit application are a little bit less demanding, less complex, whereas a larger, more complex development is going to take a bit more work. The complex developments, every complex development, so if it's 3 units or more, you're going to need to have your engineering submission sealed by a professional engineer that's registered to practice in the Yukon. For simple developments, there are different types of simple development. One would be development of a Whistle Bend lot in a new subdivision. And then there's an infill development, which would mean that you're developing, say, an existing lot in an already built out area of Whitehorse, like Riverdale or Porter Creek. In those situations, the design can often be a bit more complex because you need to consider existing surrounding conditions. So we also ask for those infill type developments that the engineering package for development permit be sealed by a professional engineer.
Great. Okay, next slide, Aaron. So one of those requirements for both of the whether complex or non-complex is to have a servicing plan showing how you're going to service for water and sewer. And there's more details in each of those guidelines on the requirements for those. I guess we'll just make a special note here that, you know, ATCO, ensuring ATCO, you have adequate service from an electrical perspective. That is through ATCO, and we don't lead or participate in that discussion, and it's important for the developer to reach directly out to ATCO for that. Sometimes you know, a developer will start looking at the services and realize that the existing services aren't adequate to service the contemplated development or the and there's a few different, you know, we can't get into every situation, and every case is different, but we highly encourage developers to reach out to us early on to understand those constraints and talk about options. A really great way for that is through the pre-application meetings, which we highly encourage developers to take advantage of on the especially the complex developments. And those are, you know, administered through the development officers, and there's a form to fill out. It is optional, but they're, I guess I just want to put a plug in for developers to make use of those when possible. And then on the simple side as well, always willing to you know, talk about constraints and strategize with developers as required on those. So anything else, Shayla, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe just note that, like the note at the bottom of this slide, we note that, you know, there are some aspects to development that will be reviewed through both of the permitting streams. At time of development permit, the services will be reviewed for compliance with our servicing standards manuals. So, you know, that includes things like the service material, and we'll be checking it against, you know, the service cards for your individual property and make sure everything's in the right location. And also all of the details that we spell out in the engineering guidelines that pertain to your specific development. And in the building permit application, we'll let Richard speak to this in the next section, but they will be honing a little bit more in on the actual water service size. They take a look at the water service size in relation to requirements of the National Plumbing Code, and they look at that a little bit more in more detail than engineering will. So that's an example of something that will be reviewed in both permitting stages, but for different aspects of the development.
Great, thank you. Next slide, Aaron. Thanks.
So fire flows, we wanted to touch on this because it's anticipated that there might be some challenges for densification development in relation to fire flows. So we wanted to kind of touch on what fire flows are. So for anything that involves 4 units or more, the city's engineering department will review what's available on our municipal network in relation to providing water for fire protection for the development. So this is separate from the amount of water you need for domestic use. This is the amount of water that you need to adequately provide fire protection for your development. Now, there's 2 terms in relation to fire flows. There's the available fire flow. So when we talk about available fire flow, that's referring to what we have on our system now. Required fire flow, however, is a term that we use for the amount of water that is calculated to be needed to adequately support your development in relation to very specific aspects of your development. So there's a number of things that come into play there, and they're all wrapped into a formula that is put together in a document that's provided by the Fire Underwriter Survey. It's a national organization, and I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but the fire underwriter survey requirements tie into the city's insurance grade. So there is an impact. So that's why we use this particular document to drive our reviews. So there's a formula in this document. We welcome people to reach out to us if they would like to see a copy of it. You can also Google the Fire Underwriters Survey, and they have links to their documents there. But happy to, if you wanted to contact the Engineering Services Department, we're happy to provide a copy of that document to give you an idea of what the formula looks like. Things that are considered as part of the required fire flow calculation would be things like how big of a development you have, how big the floor area is, whether or not your development is split into individual floor areas that have fire separations between them. What is the distance to existing structures around your proposed development? That has an impact on the required flow. Location of existing hydrants. Do you need a new hydrant to provide those maximum distances from the hydrant to your development? That's informed by this calculation as well as minimums that are set out in the National Building Code as well. Your required fire flow can be reduced if you're installing a sprinkler system in your building. And the types of construction assemblies you're considering for your development can also impact. And all of these things are outlined in the Fire Underwriters Survey document that you can access online or access through us. We like to point this out because it's something certainly to consider early on in a proposed development. And there are parts of the city that just the existing infrastructure was not necessarily constructed many years ago to accommodate densification. So it's something to think about early on. And it's certainly something that we would look at as part of a pre-application meeting if somebody had set a meeting to discuss with us. And as Taylor mentioned, we're always available to answer questions. I think that's about it from us. Yeah.
Pass it on to Richard to speak on the building code.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. Yep, the building code, of course, will apply to all developments. And I'll note that we have to be careful about definitions. So the building code does define a secondary suite. And all our definitions are distinct and different than what the zoning bylaw is using. So important things to keep in mind because the regulations do change. You can only have one secondary suite within a principal use. More than that, things get a bit more difficult. We will be looking at things like how you get from, say, a garden suite to off the property, distance to hydrants. Some of this is overlap a little bit with engineering. And of course, having a clear path of travel for exiting. So just think if you're in a a garden suite in the backyard with no back lane, we want to make sure people can get away to safety at any time of day and be protected on the way. So they're all building code requirements. They get a little complicated. Really recommend for people to talk with an architect or a designer early in your process because all of these things will affect the financial viability of your project. And in some cases may require you to look at changes in your existing building from the amount of openings, the type of cladding on the outside, and that sort of thing. So just to be mindful of the building code. There's been no changes to the building code to we've changed zoning to allow you to put the units, but the building code has not reduced any of the requirements. I think that's an important thing to consider. as with the other departments, we're happy to set up pre-meetings with you if it helps. But again, I do encourage consulting with professionals early on in your project. It's hard to be really specific on this stuff because it's very site specific and building specific. How far you are from property lines, how far you are from other buildings, topography, whether you have a lane or don't have a lane, they're all intertwined, with also meeting all your zoning requirements. So, yep, that's about all I have because it is so site specific. It is very general. I'm sorry about that, but yep, happy to answer any questions though.
Thanks, Richard. I'm just going to touch quickly on development incentives that are available for these types of developments. I would note that as of 2024, through a comprehensive review of the city's development incentives, the city has moved towards incentivizing non-market supportive and rental housing. But we do have a suite incentive, which people can take advantage of, and that provides up to $5,000 for the return of the fee of a development cost charge, which is about $2,200, as well as any other development fees. So your permit costs, inspection costs, and so forth. And that suite incentive aligns well with the government of Yukon, who provides a matching incentive of $10,000 per suite. And that actually, sorry, just going back to the city as well, you can receive 2 suite incentives per property, and same with YG, you can receive 2 $10,000 incentives. They also have a housing initiatives fund, which developments of 4 units or more can take advantage of. There's just some requirements for affordable housing as part of that. And then still on suites, at the Government of Canada, they are launching a secondary suite loan program that was part of the budget in 2024. We're still awaiting details on that, but it's expected to be released in early 2025 and provide up to $40,000 in loans. And just touching on getting started, this is kind of summarizing a lot of what we've already talked about. But if you are interested in adding units to an existing lot or purchasing a lot, you're really going to want to look at the lot dimensions, the grading, what access looks like on the lot. Is there a laneway or is it just street access when you're evaluating a lot? And similarly, you want to look at zoning to ensure the development regulations of the day enable what you want to do. And there is still differences in development regulations between certain zones. You also, once you have this, you want to look at the financial feasibility of your project. So is it financially viable if you're looking for a certain return, or if you're just looking to break even and add more units to your lot? We do, in the guide, have some resources that include example pro formas for small scale multi-unit housing. And I'll touch on that briefly. And then finally, once all that's done, you want to work on a site design, site plan, building plan, and servicing plan. And really, as has been said before, you want to ensure that you get the right professionals involved at the early stages. Often that might be required, like in the case of a sealed engineer in the Yukon. But even when it's not strictly required, it definitely helps the permitting process go smoother when you can have a professional on board from the get-go. And these resources are linked in the guide, but there is several good resources out there for this kind of development from external agencies and organizations. Standard housing design catalogs are becoming more available, as well as sample designs. Just noting, these designs are not pre-approved by the city of Whitehorse, but they can serve as a starting point or an inspiration. Also, the CMHC intends to release a standard housing design catalog for the North in early 2025. So I just stay tuned on that because it is being completed with an architect that has an office in Whitehorse with a northern context in mind. And finally, I just want to note on some related events that we have coming up. So we're going to be hosting some small scale multi-unit development workshops in late January 2025. The exact dates and registration are still forthcoming. But these will be facilitated by an architect, and it's just going to dive a bit deeper into what we talked about today, and as well as give you some hands-on time with an architect to work through some initial site planning and design considerations. There's also a Whitehorse building workshop coming up, and I'll just link the registration for that. Today is the last day to register, but it is an opportunity for builders, contractors, suppliers, and other people in the industry to learn and share information about our building permit process and local building requirements. And that's all day December 2nd, as well as part of the day on December 3rd. And then finally, we are still completing our zoning bylaw rewrite, which is expected to conclude in 2025. And the best way to stay up to date on that would be to go to the zoning bylaw rewrite page on our Engage Whitehorse website, and you can put your email there to stay up to date on developments. So there will be future engagement and feedback opportunities for that project. And then finally, we are hosting the same webinar on Thursday. The only difference will be is that we advertise that one for the development industry. The real key difference is if there's a lot of questions to take in, then we might prioritize some more technical and in-depth questions over maybe general questions. And with that, I see there is questions in the Q&A. I just want to note before that, we have a brief survey that I just posted in the chat. If you have a chance, I would really appreciate if you could complete that survey. It helps us improve on future engagements on this topic, help us know what you'd like to be covered more in depth, or maybe any questions you feel weren't answered or you want clarification on. But with that, there is some questions in the Q&A. And maybe Darcy or Micah, you could touch on the difference between a living suite and a duplex. And the question was, is the living suite and duplex the same?
Sure, I could respond to that. Thanks for the question. Not quite. Yeah, it's kind of can be a little bit confusing. So living suites and garden suites they need to be related to a principal dwelling, and they're kind of restricted in terms of how big they can be. So they tend to be small units. A duplex is like a duplex unit wouldn't be restricted by that size limitation, and also wouldn't be restricted by the requirement to be related to the principal dwelling. So living garden suites can't be subdivided and sold separately. They can't be separated out into a separate real estate entity, whereas like a duplex can be subdivided by condominium, and each unit can be bought and sold separately. Suites, so they have to be related to a principal dwelling. It is possible to have suites in conjunction with duplex units. So you could, one of our examples there, I think Aaron, maybe the slide before or something, shows, the bottom image here shows a duplex, and each of those duplex units has a suite within it. They are allowed in conjunction with duplex units, but it's not exactly the same thing. They're not quite treated the same.
Thanks, Darcy. I would just note you can also feel free to raise your hand, especially if that was your question in the Q&A and you wanted to further follow up on that. But on to the next question. If engineering could answer this one, it is, what is the difference between carried out and sealed and completed and sealed with regards to complex development and engineer involvement?
I think that maybe that's just a language. We've used a couple of different terms in the slideshow, but ultimately the submitted engineering designs need to be sealed by an engineer. Carried out and completed being different language, that we were just being inconsistent with our language there. I hope that clarifies.
And speaking with engineering, can you explain the guiding logic for dividing engineering requirements at 3 units in terms of our guidelines and requirements? And the comment attached to this was, this could unduly punish ADUs or garden suites on a lot, which is what half funding was designed to create help create more stock of? And when these guidelines were developed, were other municipalities used as a frame of reference? Sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. The 3 units or more trigger for becoming a complex development is directly tied to the definition of multiple housing in the zoning bylaw. So maybe I could defer to Darcy to speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the zoning bylaw has long defined multiple housing as being 3 or more units on the same lot. And in the kind of the context of the like sort of pre small scale multi-unit housing regulations, we had a pretty clear like 2-stream review process where if you're doing 1 unit on a lot, it was a simple development and there was a simple review process. As you if you're doing 3 or more, you're multiple housing and that wouldn't have been typically allowed in like in sort of like single housing zones. So in terms of why it's still divided that way, it's I don't know. Like I think the short answer is in the interim, as we were bringing these regulations in, we decided to stay the course that that cutoff would be 3. I think there is an opportunity, and I don't want to speak on your behalf there, Shayla and Taylor, but I think there is an opportunity to talk about maybe sort of revisiting that review process for at least for multi-unit developments in the low density zones. So that might be something that could be a procedural change coming forward. But as we kind of like step into this new world, I think we just decided to stay the course on that 2-stream review process to begin with.
Thanks, Saul. We do have some more questions in the Q&A, but I have someone with their hand up. Ian, I'm just gonna allow your mic and you unmute yourself and ask your question to the group.
Ian, if you're talking, we still can't hear you. You do need to click on that little microphone to unmute yourself now that your mic's been enabled.
Maybe in the meantime, we'll just. Oh, sorry, maybe in the meantime, we'll come back to Ian and we'll just address another question. So this one for Richard, where can builders go on the City of Whitehorse website to determine if potable water, sewer, fire, water servicing adequately supports proposed development on a particular building site? In other words, has the potable water, sewer, fire infrastructure capacity already been calculated for each street in Whitehorse? And are the results of the capacity calculations already publicly available? If not, when will the results of the capacity calculations be made publicly available for the City of Whitehorse? And that might also be an engineering question as well.
We can speak to currently how we identify what the capacity is on the network. Typically, we will ask a developer if it depends. Like if it's in Whistle Bend, we can carry out an analysis because it's a new system and we have the system has been designed by a consultant for particular capacity. We can check what's available on a hydrant, what the available flow is. If it's in an existing built-out area of Whitehorse, we ask that the developer carry out a hydrant flow test. It's a service that our water and waste department provides. However, they don't provide that over the winter months, but they provide that when those hydrants are commissioned and running for a fee. There are times though when those flow tests are not available, like I mentioned. So there is the opportunity for the city to take a look at our calibrated water model to identify what's available. This won't necessarily apply to the types of builds we're discussing today, but I might just mention it in the event that there is someone is thinking about a development that requires a section of private water main on their property. I don't see that being the case for this type of development, but if that were the case, then we would actually ask the developer's engineer to model what would be available on the site and provide a report identifying to us what that looks like. I hope that helps.
I think we'll just try and go back to Ian. Ian, I have enabled your mic, and I just know you're still muted, but that's on. I believe that's on your end that you need to unmute. But if we are having technical difficulties, you can always post a question in the Q&A or in the chat. We can answer it there. Okay, maybe we'll try Ravi, who has their hand raised as well. Ravi, I just enabled your mic. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Sure. So my question is, if I have a single family house that already has a legal suite in it, can I add a third suite in it? Or second suite, I mean.
Darcy?
Short answer is yes. Yeah, so total number of suites can't be more than 2. Total number of dwellings overall can't be more than 4. As long as you're able to meet all the development regulations of the zoning, servicing, and building code, then yes, you can add more units or more units.
And would I need engineer's seal on it for the second unit, or it's exempt?
It would depend if you're changing the amount of site coverage, and I'll turn it over to Shayla and Taylor to speak to that.
Yeah, Rami, generally, if you're working within your existing building footprint and you're not modifying the site drainage plan, it wouldn't be necessary. However, if you are adding, expanding your footprint, then you need to take another look at the drainage, and then it depends on the number of units then yes, you would.
Something that you would need to consider is the servicing size, because you will be adding additional fixtures to the existing building. So that won't be reviewed by engineering at time of development permit, but that would be reviewed through buildings at time of building inspection. And they will be looking at the number of fixtures you have in your dwelling and whether or not your existing water service will be adequate to service everything.
Thank you. That's all I have.
I have a question in the chat. So we mentioned that changes on setbacks. Are there also changes to height restrictions? I had a 22 feet height restriction that doesn't allow for a proper 2-story suite with sloped roof or a suite to be built on top of a garage. Was the allowable height of garden suites raised to accommodate these issues? Darcy, you could speak to that, I think.
Yeah, sure thing. There was no change in regulation to the maximum height of either the principal dwelling or to garden suites. However, depending on the siting, like if so you'd still be restricted to 7 meters, which is a little bit more than 22 feet for the garden suite. But if it's sited properly, it could be taller and it could be larger as just another dwelling unit. So it would no longer meet the definition of a garden suite, but it could be allowed as another dwelling on the site, subject to the siting regulations for a principal dwelling. So at that rate, you could build something taller.
Okay, I think we'll try and go back to Ian, or actually there's a new question. So similar question, if I have a house with a principal unit and a living suite and I already rent out both suites, can I add a garden suite as well that I would rent out? Darcy.
Yeah, same. That sounds similar to Ravi's question there. So you've got one house with a living suite in it already. It doesn't matter to us if they're both rented or not, as long as they're both being used as housing. Um, yeah, like a garden suite could be added to that as well. Again, provided it meets all the zoning, building code and engineering requirements.
And Ian, we'll go back to you one more time and see if we can hear you this time. Okay, I don't think. Oh, I do see Ravi's raise their hand again. I'll just sorry. Ravi, feel free to ask your question.
Sure. Yeah, one more question I have is this anywhere restricted to my own house where I'm living in, or I have an independent house that's rented out that has the principal unit and a suite that I'm allowed to add extra unit in it?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, the zoning bylaw is not concerned with like in terms of the zoning regulations. Doesn't matter if you live in it yourself or not. So if you own another property and you wanted to build up to 4 units and all of them are rental units used as rental housing, that's allowed. Yeah.
Thank you.
And there's a question, if I have a property that slopes down slightly into the backyard to build a garden suite, will I have to add material to the site? Or are there other options besides raising the backyard grade?
Yeah, generally we're going to require that there's slope away from all structures and that drainage is directed off-site to a lane or a street. If your existing site is a bit low in the backyard, that might require the introduction of some fill to make that happen.
I see, Richard, you also have your hand up. Maybe it's a follow-up to that, or is it something separate? And you are muted, Richard. Okay, a quick question. Is there a maximum size allowable for a garden suite? Yes, it's 100 meters squared within our urban containment boundary and 150 meters squared within country residential areas. Correct me if I'm wrong, Darcy or Micah.
That's correct, but just to clarify, like these new housing, like 2 suites or up to 4 units doesn't apply in country residential. So there's no change to the regulations there. So for all intents and purposes today, the maximum size to be considered a garden suite is 100 square meters.
And another question from the chat, other than the 50% land coverage or site coverage, is there a maximum square footage that I could do for could I do a fourplex all over 2,000 square feet? So I think it's just a question if there's max square footage for a unit compared to the site coverage for the lot.
There's no, so there's a maximum gross floor area for living in garden suites, 100 square meters. Other than that, there's no explicit maximum size of units that you're allowed to do. So you're restricted on the site coverage, you're restricted on the building height. There's other site design requirements like parking and so on that need to still be met. And setbacks, of course. So those all kind of indirectly contribute to like sort of a maximum build potential, but there isn't like an expressly stated like a maximum size for any unit other than living and garden suites.
I will just add that overall area of the proposed development would also impact the required fire flows on the water network.
Going back to the sloping slightly in the backyard, I do see Richard said if the lot is lower in the back, sewer may require a pump system, which is the owner's responsibility to install and maintain. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Richard, but I just noticed your hand is up.
That's because I can't lower it. I was having some tech problems here. Yeah. So yeah, with the rear sloping, I mean, where services are located can be a bit difficult, and it's worth looking at early in the project.
And Ravi, your hand is still up. I don't know if that's from the previous question or if you have a new one.
Oh, I think that was from a previous question, but I got some question that you can probably answer. So if there's a single family house that's 200 square feet, is there any minimum requirement for the rental unit or the secondary unit in it, square footage?
Not in the zoning bylaw. So it previous, like, a couple 15, 20 years ago, the zoning bylaw did actually have minimum sizes for units, but it doesn't anymore. So as long as you're able to meet the building code requirements, then there's no minimum size for units under the zoning bylaw. Richard might be able to speak a little bit more to the sort of what might go into the building code requirements that would sort of constrain how small you can make the unit. Yeah, I don't know, Richard, if you want to speak to that.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Darcy. There's not much in the building code anymore for minimum sizes. Obviously, having a private bathroom and a kitchen area and being able to meet your exiting and egress requirements, but that's really about it. So an open space with a bathroom, 200 square feet's probably a doable amount. It would probably be hard to get much under that, though.
And Richard, if I could ask a follow-up question. So, in this sort of, people imagine like the tiny house type of configuration where you might have like a bed in a loft with like a ladder or something like that. Is that compliant with the code, or would that be like if you're having steps and sort of sleeping quarters up top, would that sort of add some complication to that minimum size?
Yes, it would. Any space you have up there would have to be accessible by a legal set of stairs, which, a legal set of stairs is roughly 150 square feet with landings. So that's with an 8-foot ceiling. So that's one of the reasons the so-called tiny houses are so difficult to actually implement.
We have a question in the chat. So is there a way to calculate whether the water supply and sewage will be sufficient? You mentioned the number of fixtures. Do you have a rough idea of how many fixtures, kitchens, bathrooms, etc., can be put on a lot in Riverdale? Do you roughly know if the houses in Riverdale generally have enough water supply and sewage piping to accommodate 3 to 4 dwellings? I think that would go to engineering.
I will defer to Richard in relation to the specifics of the fixture count and the sizing for the servicing. I will mention that something to consider when you're looking to build in Riverdale and add units in Riverdale, you do need to consider what you have in the ground now. It's possible that you might have newer services run to your property, and it's possible that you might have services that are beyond their design life that need to be replaced. Engineering will review that whether or not the materials for your services are adequate. That's set in the Servicing Standards Manual. That's also available on the city's website to take a look at. But in relation to the actual service size, in relation to fixture count, I'll let Richard speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, Shayla. As I understand, and Shayla will correct me if I'm wrong, most of Riverdale's on 3/4 inch copper, which means you get generally a hose bib, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, and a powder room, and your washer dryer. So most homes there are already at the limits of that 3/4 inch copper. You're looking if you're trying to get like a house with a secondary suite within it and a garden suite, you're probably, if it were copper, you'd probably be up around 1.25 inches. The pipe suite, the insulated HD H the pipes we use now are insulated, I think are 1 inch, and they actually handle about 48 fixture units, which would, if done carefully, you would get the 3 units with for a new service.
I
You
will
can do
add
all,
that,
oh,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
oh, I was just going to say, you can do fixture counts. It's right in the section 2.6 of the plumbing code, or if you email us, we can send you, we have a spreadsheet that you just put in the number of bathrooms and things, and it will calculate the fixture count for you.
And I will add that if you do want to know what the servicing is to your property, you can reach out to engineering services and we can provide you with a copy of the service card for your property. It's very possible that we have records of what's being run to your property currently.
So another question, is it possible to add a living suite or garden suite to a freehold townhome if area requirement or other building code requirements are met? The answer is yes, but maybe Darcy or Richard could speak to some of the challenges that might come along with the townhome, adding a suite to a townhome.
Yeah, townhouses, that we did open up the possibility that living or garden suites could be allowed in conjunction with townhouses. Practically speaking, I think trying to fit a living suite within an existing townhouse would be pretty challenging, because townhouses, with very few exceptions, they have the parking at the rear, but they need access to the front for like emergency services and stuff like that. So it has to already be designed with the ability for both the suite and the principal unit to have an access at both the front and the back. Making that work with existing townhouses, I think, would be challenging, and I don't know like how challenging, but with a newly designed townhouse development, it might be a little bit easier to work that in the first place, and just kind of fit that into the design right from the get-go. Garden suites, so because of that requirement that there be access from the street, like for example, if the fire truck needs to show up, they're not going to go around and down the lane. There's no hydrants back there anyway. So there needs to be that access from the street. And so in terms of garden suites, the real only practical possibility would be on end units that actually have a setback on one side, and that access would still need to be able to be provided to a garden suite in the rear. There are no lots in town, I think, where a garden suite could be in the side or front yard in conjunction with a townhouse. So yes, it's possible. I think, again, for existing townhouses, would be quite challenging. For newly built townhouses, there might be a little bit more possibility with the living suites, and garden suites, I think, would probably be a stretch in most cases.
Building code wide, they're fairly straightforward, just your fire separations and how you do your entrance areas, but there are ways to do combined ones. Just take some good code knowledge and time to figure out. And then, of course, your service size could be an issue as well.
Another question, what restraints are there regarding condominiumizing or subdivision? Darcy or Micah, maybe?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, if you're doing up to 4 units, 2, 3, or 4 units can be subdivided by condominium, except if they're living or garden suites. So if they meet the definition of a living or garden suite and you want to get the benefit of that reduced parking calculation and the incentives that come along with developing suites, those cannot, they have to be they have to be within the same parcel as a principal dwelling. It is possible that you could, for example, take a duplex, add a suite to each of those and subdivide the principal duplex units into like a 2-unit condominium. But generally speaking, 2-unit condominiums are a little bit, they're not impossible, but they're not, they can be challenging just with only having 2 parties to that relationship. 3 or 4 units is a little bit more manageable and more typical. I guess long story short, if they're not living or garden suites, they can be subdivided and owned separately. If they are suites, then they can. It's less likely, but theoretically possible for a living suite to be or a garden suite to be within the same condominium unit as principal unit.
There's a question, who do I contact to see if building a garden suite is feasible and cost effective versus building an addition to the primary residence, such as a living suite? Any architects or anyone specific? That's in the chat.
Yeah, well, I think pretty early on in the process, you do need to decide to retain a professional, whether it's an architect or somebody like it doesn't have to be an architect. It could be somebody just with building code and design experience. But you do need to sort of like the city can provide some information in terms of existing services, the nearby hydrants and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, like the design needs to be done by a third party, either yourself if you're capable of that, or in most cases, it's going to be somebody with the professional experience to be able to take what's existing and design something that either works within that or consider what sort of improvements to the servicing need to be done to actually achieve what you need. I think we're looking, and Aaron, maybe you could chime in. We are looking to help develop some more information and tools that might help inform people on sort of making decisions about feasibility and stuff like that. But again, at some point there will need to you do need to engage like a third party that's not the city that will help you kind of weigh the options and come up with something that meets your needs.
Yeah, we will be looking at trying to provide some of those materials in the new year, sort of maybe late winter, early spring. But I would just stay tuned for that. And the only person, oh, I see something. A comment from Phil, more accessible information would be great. Builders are not helpful for info. If you wanted to speak more to that, feel free to raise your hand. But I am going to go back to Ian. I haven't forgot about you there. So if you have been waiting patiently, I appreciate it. And we'll just try one more time. But maybe you don't have a question anymore. I'm not sure. But I've allowed your mic, Ian. You just need to unmute. Okay, well, we can't hear anything. Is there any other questions out there? Anyone? We have about 10 minutes left that we allocated, so we do have some time. If anyone has some questions. Just give it a minute. And we'll just post the guide that accompanied this presentation in the chat again, just with a note that it's a living document. So as we are rewriting the zoning bylaw, that guide will need to change to align with the new regulations and definitions and zones that come with that. Oh, Ian, when I click on the mute, it says only certain people can connect. I have you, I'll disable, allow. Yeah, I've allowed your mic, Ian. I'm not quite sure. It might just be a Teams issue, unfortunately. Sometimes wires get crossed.
And feel free to type in your question too if the mic's still not working.
If you are chatting and we can't hear you, I do see there's a bit of flashing going on, so I suspect, yeah, I'm not sure. Apologies, Ian. I don't know what the issue is, but yeah, like Darcy said, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A if you can, or if you'd like to follow up after the webinar, that's also an option. This question from the chat, you mentioned it is challenging to create a 2-unit condo. Is this a challenge with the city or some other organization that makes it challenging?
I guess what I meant by that was like there are quite a few 2-unit condominiums already existing in the city. And what we've found with those in a lot of cases, the two parties to that there's not a lot that kind of ties them together other than that they're like this would be like in a duplex form that their units are attached. But in terms of the sort of like working together as a condo unit and making decisions together, there's some challenges in terms of how do you break a tie or whatever if you can't agree on something. We've also seen a lot of, not a lot, but we've had some instances where people have actually looked at trying to sort of dissolve their condo and subdivide into 2 fee simple lots instead, because they weren't finding that the condo situation was very favorable for them. The short answer is it's not the city, it's not the city's challenge, and the city is the subdivision approving authority, and so that getting a city approval is part of it. That's not really the challenge so much as setting up a scenario where you actually have a good good balance or sort of a good framework for managing that condominium relationship. Your follow-up question, you asked because there's a minimum lot size to allow for the creation of a duplex. So the minimum, the separately described minimum lot size for a duplex in the zoning bylaw is only for cases where each duplex unit is on a separate fee simple lot. So in that case, there's no condominium relationship at all. It's 2 separate fee simple owners. If you build a single duplex on one lot, then it's the same minimum lot sizes for building 1, 2, 3, or 4 units. So it's just the regular minimum lot size in that case.
And another question in the chat, the examples used are all based on rectangle lots. Did we look at pie-shaped lots or regular shaped lots in general?
Planners love to think in rectangles. Yeah, it's for the sake of sort of illustrative examples, Ian, yeah, they're all on kind of like a typical rectangular shaped lot. There are as you're aware, there are lots of not rectangular shaped lots out there as well. But all the same design regulations and requirements still apply. There are some cases, like for example, in Whistle Bend, like in some corners, like there's some lots that flare out quite a bit towards the rear, and they provide quite a lot more lot area. So those ones actually, some of those, even under the old rules, were allowed to build up to 3 units, and there are some examples of 3-unit developments on those lots. So they're actually more favorable than than like a smaller but rectangular lot. But yeah, I guess the like yes, you can do these developments on any shaped lot. The same regulations apply. There might be some site-specific constraints that might make it challenging to meet some of those design regulations, and on the other hand, there might actually be some advantage as well.
Another question, has thought been given to creating a plan review position or a position where building code side would be combined in the review? Not perhaps, and I know we have created some new positions and hired additional personnel. I'm not sure if any of them fall under that, but maybe engineering or land and building could speak to that.
We have nothing combined at this point. We the development permit and the building permit are effectively separate application streams, which will continue when we get on our CityWorks digital permitting system into next year.
Engineering doesn't have anything to add to that. Richard captured it.
Great. Well, we have a few 2 minutes left. So if there's any other questions out there, please feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat or the Q&A.
I can.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I can respond to the new question that's popped up there about how much time do we think development permits will now take? We don't anticipate that review times will be largely impacted by these opportunities. We will be aiming to provide our reviews in a timely manner. And I think, yeah, we don't expect that to change. Anything to add?
Nope.
I could just add one thing there. I mean, like in terms of as long as we're maintaining this two-stream review process, simple and complex applications, these zoning changes don't affect the review process for either of those cases. The only thing would be that, like, if you had applied for a single detached house and it took a couple of weeks or whatever to get your development permit, and now you're moving into a complex review stream, that complex stream, before these changes and now still with the new changes in place, it takes longer to get through that review process. But the changes themselves don't have any effect on how long it takes to actually complete those reviews.
Okay, well, that brings us to 1:30 or just about to there. I'm just going to post our contact page in the chat again. If you do have questions on any of these items, please feel free to reach out to the relevant department. You can always shoot an email to planning@whitehorse.ca. We tend to get a lot of emails that could be redirected, but we're happy to do that. And just as has already been mentioned, that we do have pre-application process, so always feel free to reach out early in the process rather than later. It can really help things get along faster, particularly with that timing question. But thank you everyone for attending. I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and we're excited to have so many people today and a lot of great questions as well. So thanks everyone.